everybody. Welcome to this NWCC webinar. This is Paige Johnson with the American Wind Wildlife Institute, and we're here at the top of the hour. I think we might still be waiting on Mike, our presenter, to get dialed in. So.
Oh, hey Paige, I'm on. Sorry.
You're on? Okay, great. Wonderful. So I'm just going to get started with a little bit of background before we turn it over to Mike. Once again, our speaker today is Michael Speerschneider from the American Wind Energy Association, and he's going to provide an introduction to wind energy siting and development. And before I go into a quick introduction, I want to go through just a couple of logistics. For sound, a lot of you are listening over your computer speakers. If you're having technical difficulties with that or anything else, you can send us an email at support@kernswest.com. That email address is listed in that notes box at the bottom of the notes box on your screen. You can also send us logistics questions through the Q&A box in the webinar room. And we will be doing a Q&A after the presentation, so if you have a question for Mike, please enter it into the Q&A box. That's at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You will only be able to see the questions you submitted in the box, not those submitted by others, but we will read the questions out loud for Mike to respond to. And feel free to type in questions anytime they come to mind, and after the presentation, once again, I'll read them out loud and we will respond so everyone can hear. For those of you who are listening on your phone, please make sure to mute your line, to mute your phone. Otherwise, we'll be getting background noise, and I will try to keep on top of that so we can hear, but it really helps if folks remember to mute their line. And then a reminder that we are recording this webinar, and it will be posted to the NWCC website shortly after the webinar. So with that, I am going to give us a little bit of an introduction, just a little bit of background about this webinar and some context about interactions between wind energy and wildlife. So the NWCC, National Wind Coordinating Collaborative, was established in 1994 by a multi-stakeholder group with the aim to better understand and address socioeconomic and environmental considerations around wind power. And it was funded by DOE and NL. And as wind became commercialized and grew, many other organizations were established to address some of these issues, including AWWI, the American Wind Wildlife Institute, which now facilitates the NWCC. So now DOE and NREL are supporting specifically outreach and education on wind energy and wildlife through the NWCC, as well as some collaborative research efforts as well. The NWCC has hosted 21 webinars over the past 8 years on the most recent research tools and strategies to address what we know and solutions for wind energy and wildlife challenges. And you'll see some links on some of these slides. And again, we're recording this webinar and the recording will be available. So if you don't get these links down now, you'll be able to see them in the recording. But that link there is to web pages for all the webinars that have been hosted under NWCC. And now, today, we are hosting this Wind 101 webinar to really look into the many considerations that there are when siting and developing wind projects, and the steps to address and avoid conflicts with wildlife are really just one of the considerations developers look into when prospecting and planning to site a project in a particular location. So it's an important consideration, but one of many considerations. So that's really what Mike will be talking about. And I wanted to note that this webinar is really focused on the siting aspect, and we will be scheduling a second webinar in this series to focus on operational considerations. So once we get that scheduled, that'll be shared through the NWCC, so watch out for that. And let's see, going to the next slide. So as a reminder, and for those of you who may not be aware, with wind energy and wildlife, there are several laws, guidelines, and policies, regulations that wind developers and operators need to make sure to address and comply with when they're siting and operating wind projects. And some of the the relevant federal laws, this is for land-based wind. Some of the relevant laws are the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the Department of Interior, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, developed voluntary guidelines called Land-Based Wind Energy Guidelines, which a lot of people shorthand to WEGs. And Mike will go into a lot more detail about these, but just as a really quick background, the WEGs are based on a consensus recommendation that resulted from a 7-year Federal Advisory Committee process convened by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and that included representation from the service, other federal agencies, states, the wind industry, conservationists, and scientists. And based on that consensus agreement, the service published the WEGs in 2012, and they outline a tiered approach where developers identify whether they're a risk to wildlife, and then it sets up steps developers take to avoid and minimize risks by guiding collection of increasingly detailed information as the developer moves through the tiers. So I've got a link here. Let's see, it looks like the formatting got a little off putting it into the webinar room, so I'll make sure that that link is available on the NWCC website following this webinar. And then in terms of states, the regulations, guidelines, policies, recommendations really vary from state to state. Some states have regulations or guidelines, more formal regulations or guidelines that developers need to follow. And some states may work with the Fish and Wildlife Service or other state regulatory agencies to develop recommendations. So for more information on states, there's a link there to some information about state regulations. The second link is to the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, which has information on state fish and wildlife agencies. And there are also resources on the NWCC website in the resources page specific to states that have content about wind energy. All right, and then in terms of the species that we're thinking about when we're thinking about wind energy and wildlife, several species are protected under the laws I mentioned, and additionally we've learned over years of research that there are certain species or groups that may be more vulnerable to direct fatalities. So most recently, results of the analysis of the American Wind Wildlife Information Center, which we call AWIC, analysis, this is a database, and analysis of this data has given us a better understanding of what species are at risk. And particularly, we're looking into some species of bats, raptors, some other migratory birds. And the link at the bottom there is where you can read the analyses of data, the reports that have the analyses of data for birds and bats from the data in AWIC. And a little information really quickly about these species groups. Raptors, that's a group that includes bald and golden eagles. Appear that they may be more vulnerable to collisions with turbines than other birds. However, eagle fatalities are still quite low, but it's important to learn more about what the risk is so we can develop effective solutions, particularly considering these species are protected by law. Passerine, songbirds, make up the majority of bird fatalities at wind farms, but it does not appear that there are population-level impacts. And we're also finding that certain species of bats are more at risk, and bats are an ecologically important group and economically important for ecosystem services. They provide things such as insect control. And we're still learning a lot about bats and finding really that only certain species are affected and that there's a lot of variation, particularly among geographic region and even specific wind farms. So learning more about bats is a high priority both for AWWI and the rest of the wind wildlife community. So again, I'll direct your attention to the link on the screen. There are other publications in this catalog that's linked to on AWI's website about bats and wind energy as well. And lastly, there are some concerns about impacts to habitat, particularly for species that depend on unfragmented habitat to thrive. So as you see on the slide, that can include certain grassland and shrubland birds. All right, and so now our speaker, Michael Speerschneider, will walk us through the steps and factors that go into siting a wind project, both wildlife and non-wildlife related. And I have a little bio here for Mike. So Michael Speerschneider is the Senior Director to Permitting Policy and the Environmental Affairs at the American Wind Energy Association, AWEA. At AWEA, he heads up efforts to address regulatory and policy issues related to wildlife and siting of land-based wind projects across the U.S. And over the past 2.5 years with AWEA, he has engaged with multiple stakeholders to promote efficient permitting of wind energy projects while promoting species conservation and wildlife values. Prior to joining AWEA, he spent nearly 15 years in the industry, the wind industry, developing and permitting wind and solar industry, developing and permitting wind and solar projects. He has led efforts to secure the first incidental take permit for Indiana bats for a wind project and led on multiple other permitting programs. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike. It's just going to take a few seconds here to load this PowerPoint. But Mike, as soon as you see the slides, please go ahead and take it away.
Okay, well, thank you, Paige, and thank you all. So, yeah, pretty hefty group here, so hope to bring some important and some valuable information to you all. I know many of you may have heard some of this, but I wanted to go through at a pretty high level and maybe give a little bit of details on, as Paige said, the permitting process as a whole. We'll focus a bit on the non-wildlife factors in the siting and permitting process, including some of the economic factors. And then we'll spend a bit of time going through a bit more, slightly below the surface of the wind energy guidelines, and just as a primer or a reminder of how the wind energy guidelines work. Do feel that many of you probably have heard of what the wind energy guidelines are, but I don't know how many of you actually have read them and go through at least recently, and I think it's worth kind of reminding us all how the WEGs actually work and what is in them. So I will hope to walk through that in a way that makes sense to you all, and then we'll be happy to take some questions. So just in general, as I go through this, I think I want to kind of hit 4 central themes here. The first is I don't want to skip over the sort of benefits of wind, sort of getting to the why there's a wind industry to begin with. Then also, as I said, getting into the siting of the wind farms and the economic and making them economically viable, and where wildlife fits into that. The other theme would be that the industry has demonstrated a legacy of care when it comes to wildlife. I think this is unique for a lot of industries. I think it's part of our brand, if you will, and it's important for those reasons alone, not to mention other reasons. So that I just want to walk through some of that, and then as I said, going into the wind energy guidelines in slightly more detail. I won't bore you too much with the full explanation of the guidelines. So yeah, just to touch on the benefits. I mean, to me, a lot of this is this sort of why are we doing wind energy in the first place? If it weren't for these benefits, we just go on generating our electricity with fossil fuels and other sources and deal with the impacts of those. But we have wind energy, and over the decades, it's becoming a bigger and bigger part of our energy mix. And just to kind of give you a sense of that, at the end of 2019, wind energy did account for 6.5% of the nation's electricity, which is still on the small side compared to some of the other sources, but it's far bigger than I thought it would be, frankly, but it's still got a long ways to go. And it kind of points to the fact that this is in some ways, in a lot of ways, still a very young industry. So that is important not only to consider the wildlife impacts, but also all of the other components of this in terms of the benefits and other parts of the supply stream, if you will. That 6.5, and I should say, I think we just made an announcement that in the U.S. we have passed the 100 gigawatt number, so that's a big milestone in terms of installed capacity. So that amount, at least at the end of 2018, was enough to avoid 200 million metric tons of carbon. What does that mean? That means 42 million cars. That's the equivalent of 42 million cars on the road. This, we think, is critically important, and especially when you're talking about the climate change piece. And the National Audubon Society was just recently released a study stating that up to 2/3 of North American birds could be at risk of extinction due to climate change. I think this is a pretty stark reminder of why we're doing what we're doing and how important it is from that standpoint. There are also benefits for habitat preservation from wind. There are when wind projects come into an area, a lot of times the landowners are looking to do something with that land that is not whatever it is when the wind energy projects come in. So whether that's agricultural, whether that's selling it off for development, commercial or residential, there are call them anecdotal evidence at this point, or stories that we've all experienced where a landowner was able to keep a land in its current use because of the wind farm, and that could have some habitat benefits. And that's not to say that we shouldn't worry about some of the habitat impacts that could occur from wind, whether it's fragmentation or otherwise. It's just to point out that there is a balance there, and there are potentially some good habitat results from wind as well. And not only that, when we're talking about mitigation for birds and bats, particularly if it's in a regulatory framework, that habitat preservation is often a part of a project proponent's conservation plan. Again, whether that's a federal or state initiative or not, you often do have those kinds of benefits. Not always, but you do. And then, besides carbon, there are other benefits when you're talking about displacing the traditional mix of fuel that's used to generate electricity in this country, and you're significantly reducing SOx, NOx, and reducing the use of fresh water that thermal plants use as cooling elements. So just wanted to take that minute to remind ourselves kind of why we're doing wind, and that when we talk about what we do as an industry to identify and reduce impacts that we may be having to wildlife, to species and habitat, that it is in that context of there are some good things that are coming from the industry as well when you talk about wildlife. So moving on then to taking a sort of a bigger picture of what the siting process looks like, and what a developer goes through to bring a project from the first knock on a door to construction and operation. And the way that this chart kind of lays it out, it's not perfect. These things change. They're different all the time, but it gives a general sense of how that works. And the things to highlight are those first on the top there, the prospecting and the initial site assessment. That's where a lot of the wildlife and habitat considerations can take place because the GIS and mapping capabilities that we have these days is so vastly improved to what it was even 10 years ago. We're able to kind of plan around some of the potentially sensitive issues right from the start. And that comes into the word of prospecting, and we're looking at the different factors and then that initial site assessment. But it's also important to note that when we call it prospecting for wind projects, obviously we need to go where the wind is blowing, where there's a strong wind resource. that's clearly number one. But there are also other factors there that do direct where it's even viable to look, and that includes things like land use. It includes transmission, where are the areas where you can efficiently hook into the transmission system and deliver power. Topography, which goes to constructability. Can you build in a certain spot? And then there are a number of other issues around willing landowners, communities, and those kind of things. So, it takes a lot of work to find a place that checks all those boxes that is potential. At this point, it's all potential, but you have to check all those boxes to make it work. And wildlife and habitat is part of that process as well. And that can all be done largely, it's called via a desktop type of analysis, where you have the GIS layers, as I said, and you can kind of map that out. But you don't really want to go too far down the road until you actually get out there and put boots on the ground and look around and make sure that what you're seeing on your maps, on your desktop, matches what's there in reality. And so that becomes an important part of that sort of very initial, very early planning and siting of projects. Once you get to that point, you say, okay, now we got to see if there are landowners that are interested in working with us, and that becomes obviously a key next step. Talking to some landowners and establishing that they're interested. This kind of cascading or decreasing block there that I show is just I mean, in some places it could be one or two landowners that have enough acreage to support a wind project. In others, you might need as many as 100 different landowners or 200 different landowners. And either way, you need to get to call it an anchor or a critical mass, so that you can support the project before you can go too far in your studies and development. But oftentimes you're working on landowner agreements well into the project, almost right up to construction. Then, as soon as you kind of get that anchor, you start worrying about the wind, the sort of high-level wind resource maps that show you where the wind is. That's great. That gives you a direction. But you really need on-site data, and you need data that spans multiple years, because obviously critical to these projects is the amount of generation you're going to see from those, and that's directly tied to the wind resource. So the engineers need as much and as good a data as possible on the wind side. So once you kind of put up towers for that, meteorological towers to do that, and then once you get going on that, then you turn to the environmental studies. And many of those are part of the WEGs, which we'll talk about here, the Wind Energy Guidelines. So they are species and habitat related. But environmental studies can be other things as well. You're modeling the sound levels that are produced at various receptors. You're modeling shadow flicker. You're looking at communication, infrastructure in and around the area, looking at FAA issues, DOD issues, just making sure that any number of those could pose a fatal conflict in terms of the viability of the project. So you're working through that. Once you get through most of those studies, and now you're kind of de-risking as you go, if you will. Once you get close to those and you feel like you have a project that can go forward, then you move into the permit acquisition stage, and that is both local permits, siting permits, ordinances, building permits, but also any federal permits that may be needed at a particular site, and whether that's ESA or BGEPA, Endangered Species Act, or the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, that you start those processes, and those processes are largely informed by those environmental studies that you've done already. So you're not going into those processes with no information. You have quite a bit of information as you start that process. And as those permits move along and are you have confidence that they're going to move in the right direction, then things like offtake agreements, meaning who's going to buy the power once you build the project. You need to start locking that down. You need to start looking at what equipment, what turbines, substation equipment will be used. And then once that's all put in place and delivered, then obviously construction begins. And that gives you to construction and then operation. Not addressing operation here. As Paige said, that would be another webinar, but that gets you to that point. So this is kind of a nice slide that you can kind of put a lot of detail in, or hopefully it paints a pretty simple picture that you can kind of look at and see, okay, yep, there's a pretty lengthy and complicated process that goes on here. And I mentioned the one box there, obviously the community engagement and making sure you're working well with a community, not just the landowners, but the neighbors and the people that will be living in that area. You want to work with them and make sure that you're being a good business partner with that community. This next slide just kind of gives you another visual of that. This is obviously in Ohio. You can see this kind of gives a sense of the constraints that are out there and what you do on this desktop analysis. Those pinks and purples are where the stronger winds are in a state like Ohio, and the greens and light greens are where there's less wind. So not a lot of wind energy interest from wind energy companies in the southeast of Ohio, but quite a bit in the north and northwest part of Ohio. And then once you get into those areas where there is wind, you see on there's some transmission lines, which are both good from the standpoint of you can connect in those and deliver power, but you also need to sort of build around them, so to speak. And then there's other things in here that you can't see, such as that topography, those topography questions, other infrastructure, homes, and those kinds of things. So that kind of lets you break down, kind of zero in on a spot, and you're going through those bullet points. Obviously, the resource, transmission system, willing landowners. Can you get to the site? Can you get there? Using the roads. Eventually, you need to bring some pretty heavy equipment in and parts in. Geotech is important as well, because you'd be digging foundations for the turbines. And then, of course, the land use. And a lot of times, a place like Ohio, it's the ag lands where there's a lot of opportunity, but that's not always the case. And you are looking in those areas, when you say ecological resources, where there's sensitive habitat, important habitat, wetlands, species concentrations. You want to identify those and avoid those if you can. Right from the start. So that's another kind of picture of that kind of high-level siting questions. I went ahead here. This is just another kind of closer view on that. So what this is showing is a map and how you might lay out those turbines. So if you can see on there, I know it's a little bit hard to see, but hopefully you can on your computers. There's the white and then the light gray. The light grays is areas that are essentially excluded from use, and those are either excluded by setbacks from roads and from homes. Could be ecological resources as well, wetlands, streams, other habitat, and what you're left with. So you have a large area, and what you're left with is the white areas, which is where you can actually look to place your turbines. And that there's also, even within that area, you have to be a certain distance from, one turbine can't be on top of the other because of waking and other issues. So you just kind of have to be able to fit all that in. And that's sometimes a challenge. It's definitely not a lot of flexibility in most cases. So what does all this mean? All these considerations that I've spent some time talking about, those sort of non-wildlife things. So like I said, the noise and the aviation and the engineering and the landowners. And with all of that, on top of all that, you are looking to minimize your species and habitat impacts. So that is kind of an overarching theme consideration for wind development, and something that is not is part of the equation, but not the only thing that we have to do. So when we talk a little bit further about the economic viability of these projects, this is just a really, really rough kind of presentation of this. If we talk about LCOE, which is the levelized cost of energy, that is essentially you take all of the costs that go into producing energy, and for wind, it's a high percentage of it is just the initial capital cost. Unlike some of the fossil fuel technologies, Obviously, you don't have to pay for fuel when you're operating a wind farm, so your operating costs are relatively quite minor. But you take the capital cost that goes in, and then you sort of spread it over the life of the project, and you get sort of the levelized cost of energy. So how many dollars per megawatt hour do you need to sell your power for, essentially, to break even? And then, of course, these companies do have to make a profit so that they can bring the investment in the first place. So, what does that mean, and how does that all play in? What I tried to kind of represent here is all of the different sort of wildlife-related approaches have a cost to them, and just really general, based on general estimates of how much this may cost. You look at some of the major categories of addressing wildlife issues. So curtailment, when I say curtailment, that means generally related to bats. We're either increasing your cut-in speeds during certain times of the year to avoid and minimize impacts to bats. Increasing cut-in speeds means there are times when you could be generating power, but you aren't. And there's a cost associated with that. There's monitoring cost, and that's the post-construction monitoring, mortality monitoring, where having people look on, right now, where we are now is the sort of best and only way to do that is having people walk transects under turbines and look for birds and bats. Some people are using dogs and other things at this point, but that's a high cost, very labor intensive. And then there are things, when we say micro-siting, so we'll move turbines here and there to avoid, whether it's an eagle nest or a habitat area. You might move a turbine or two, and that is moving them to places that are less efficient, either because they have less wind or they're farther away from your collection system. Thereby, you'll see more loss and more cost for the collection system. There's a number of different factors that go into how much that costs. And then, bat mitigation for any impacts to bats and eagles. Just as this is not all inclusive. These are just general, some of the things you might think of initially when you think about wildlife considerations. So put all that together, this just indicates that could result in anywhere from $1 to $2 or so per megawatt hour on your levelized cost of energy. Okay, it doesn't sound too much. What does that matter? This is how that matters. These projects are operating in a competitive world where to get someone to buy the power, you often have to bid. You bid a price and say, I can sell you power for X number dollars per megawatt hour, and other potential producers of power are bidding as well. And they are, so you're trying to beat out other competitors, whether it's other renewable energy, whether it's gas, whether it's anything at that point. Once we're selling power to the grid, an electron is an electron, and as far as the grid is concerned, it doesn't really matter where it comes from. So you can see on this, and this is I think it's kind of old, but it's just more to be illustrative than to be, don't take it as being, I wouldn't put this as being where the market is exactly today. In fact, I probably should have covered up the prices on the side, but just kind of give you a sense of where these lines go. So the price of some technology is going up. The wind energy levelized cost of energy is going down generally, and it's continued to do so. But we're in that phase now, that sort of 2019, 2020, all the way until 2024, 25, where it's pretty close. And usually the natural gas is the fuel that is setting the market price. So that's the one that you're concerned about getting below from a competitive standpoint. So you can see that sort of 4 or 5 year period that we're in right now, $1 or $2 could make all the difference. So it could be a pretty it's a very competitive marketplace, and every dollar counts from that standpoint. So that kind of gives you the general sense of hopefully the non-wildlife issues and the things that developers have to balance to make a project successful. So let's turn a little bit to the wildlife part now. And I talked a little bit at the beginning about the legacy of care that the industry has. And I think it's an important it's important to us, frankly, in how we approach these issues. And obviously, at the end of the day, you got to make the business work, but we want to do that in a responsible way. And we've shown, I think, over the years as an industry that is important to us. The first part of it is, okay, look at what kind of impact are we having, and spend a lot of time looking at this, and we'll continue to do so. But it's worth pointing out that the impacts to birds from wind, if you compare that to other human-caused impacts, is extremely low. Talking about a fraction of a percent of all human-caused bird fatalities is a result of wind and collisions with wind injury. For eagles, it's maybe a little bit higher than 0.01%, but there's a lot of the vast majority of wind projects based on our experience and some of the analysis that we've done. That there's not a lot of projects that are having much of an impact on eagles. There are a couple in certain areas that have had some greater impacts, and there are areas that have led to some concern and have led to us looking at ways to reduce those impacts, and those can benefit across the board. But by and large, those impacts to eagles are pretty low. And I refer to that. I mean, a lot of those do come from sort of 1980s era projects that were built in a certain part of California that have contributed. When you look at the total number of eagles that have been impacted by eagles, the vast majority is in that area. That area now, as many of you may know, is being repowered, which means those older 1980s era turbines are being replaced by more modern ones, which are bigger and taller, but far fewer. And those are showing to have quite a significant reduction in the number of eagles impacted even in that area. And then, that doesn't mean that that's the end of the story. We are, and again, as part of the legacy of care, looking at what level is low enough, and maybe we're striving for zero, and there is efforts to find technologies that will help achieve that, or at the very least help those projects with higher level of impact have less. And that's through technology, deterrent technology, detection technology, and that's there's a lot of research going in on that, which I'll talk about in a second. I think when we talk about that sort of, okay, what are we doing as an industry? I think from a bat perspective, this is the general story here was, it's 20 years ago, West Virginia, there was a project operating there. Some operators were looking around the ground one morning and noticed there were some bats around, notified the owner of that project. The company and the people involved with that project took note and said, okay, what are we going to do about this? And we've, I guess you could say, we've been working on it ever since. And it has led to a number of efforts that have gotten support, both financially and by making facilities available from the wind industry. So you have things like the Bat and Wind Injury Collaborative. You have NWCC and AWWI. You have a number of other programs, including most recently, perhaps, is the Wind and Wildlife Research Fund that is housed within AWWI, all looking to fund research in full or in part. A lot of it is directed to bats. And so what's come out of that right now? First thing was some of those early studies back in the early 2000s that showed that increasing your cut-in speed and or just feathering below manufacturer cut-in speed can significantly reduce the impacts to bats. And that was something that AWIA took and said, let's make that the BMP. Just everybody should be doing that. Everybody should be feathering under the manufacturing cutting speed. So that was a BMP that was adopted, I guess it's about 5 years ago now, and it's kind of standard practice now for projects. But beyond that, there are deterrent devices. There's smart curtailment that will. The promise with those is that it would reduce those impacts even further and do so eventually at a cost that's efficient and viable for projects. I mentioned the Wind and Wildlife Research Group. There's a bat coexistence work group, and that's focused more on the called non-listed migratory tree bats. Defenders of Wildlife and NREL are leading on that, and the industry has been involved. I think it's a great effort and really important discussions in that forum. And I kind of mentioned before, I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that companies have often and still are making their facilities available to researchers to develop, to improve, to validate these technologies, and make it so that they're things that can be used and implemented into their projects. I think we're to the point now where, especially on the deterrent and smart curtailment, not fully commercial yet in terms of ready to be deployed in mass. But there's a couple of efforts that are getting pretty close, and I think that's quite it's exciting for a lot of us. So I think I could probably skip through a lot of this slide here, kind of again highlighting some of the groups and organizations. The only thing I would add here as we kind of segue into the wind energy guidelines. The wind energy guidelines are something that are voluntary that the industry does, and comes at a cost. It's a cost that companies are willing to spend in order to make sure they're siting projects responsibly. So the wind energy guidelines. We turn to those, and I think probably the remainder of my time anyway, I'll just kind of go through this, and again, just a high-level touch on this. What are the wind energy guidelines? Well, it's more of a framework for how you make decisions. Very important to this is that it's not a one-size-fits-all, that each project goes through the process, makes decisions with these guidelines, and comes to a hopefully a reasonable conclusion. It's about collecting information. It's about evaluating risk. It's about making your siting and operational decisions, with wildlife and conservation in mind. Each tier, and there's 5 tiers. Each tier you go through, there are in the guidelines, there are questions, there are methods and metrics, and there are decision points. And so the idea is you work through all those, and again, not every company does it exactly the same way, but it does provide those guidelines, and you're kind of making those fact-based, information-based decisions, and working with state and federal agencies to do so. Excuse me. I think Paige went over a lot of this. I mean, just kind of the background there. 2003, there was actually the Fish and Wildlife Service interim guidelines that were released, and companies kind of looked at those and used those as a guide for how best to go about wind project siting. They needed a lot of work on that. So in 2007, Secretary of Interior created the Federal Advisory Committee. They worked for 3 years to put together a set of recommendations that were then sent to the Secretary. And in 2012, the wind energy guidelines were published as final. And I think Paige mentioned, it's worth mentioning again, that FACA consisted of a number of different stakeholder entities, including the industries, including tribes, including agencies, including conservation community. So it was a very robust process that came up with these guidelines. As you look at the guidelines, it is important to keep in mind that scope and scale part of it. I kind of mentioned this before. I mean, the guidelines, and very importantly, allow for approach to be tailored to each site. That it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. I think that was decided within the FAC, or recognized within the FAC during that process, is that you can't have that, hey, everybody's going to do it this way. It just doesn't work. So this framework allows that tailoring. And even within that, not every project should or needs to go through every single tier. And that plays out in different ways. I think I can say in most cases, at least for the first 3 or 4 tiers, every company that applies the way does do it, like I said, in some form each tier. So what do those tiers look like? So you get through these fairly quickly here, but the first tier is this preliminary site selection. So this is, I talked about it at the front of it, this is mostly a desktop analysis. And again, these days it's very valuable. I can say when I first started developing projects, we didn't have the GIS capabilities we had, so it was a lot of footwork and going around places and trying to get maps and laying maps on top of each other and trying to figure it out. Now you just ask your GIS guy to download some data files and you can get a real good sense of what's going on in an area. But you're looking for things that are classified and identified in those GIS layers, and that can be anything from congregation areas, different habitat types, and areas that are sort of designated by law, such as parks and those types of things. So you can get a good sense of that. And you're just using the existing public data in those places. Sometimes in a Tier 1, you might also go and check in with a field office of the Fish and Wildlife Service or a state agency. That's really kind of more of a Tier 2 thing, which I'll talk about in a second. But you go through that Tier 1 and you've got, the questions come up. You can look at all those questions and there's no's and yeses. And a yes meaning that there could be an issue does not, especially at this stage, doesn't necessarily mean abandon the project and go away. It just means you can consider abandoning that project, but you also want to consider modifying your project, or it'll inform your Tier 3 studies to better understand what's there and what potential conflicts could arise. So, what are the takeaways for Tier 1? It is your first interaction with some of the Fish and Wildlife in the states, and at least in their databases. So, a lot of states have the natural heritage programs where you can just download some of that information. I guess just kind of paint the picture of how a lot of companies work for it. It's given the GIS capabilities now, it's not so much of a, well, here's a little, a 1,000-acre spot, let's pull all this data and do this. It's more of a, we have this information for whole states or whole regions, and you almost use that with the map that I showed before with the wind resource, and you can overlap and say, okay, where are there places that are free from a lot of these areas we might want to avoid and have strong wind, and you can kind of narrow down your area of interest pretty quickly that way. You do in this phase, you can identify those non-starters, and like I said, that just kind of comes here. For example, a national park. I don't know if anybody would, any developers would seriously look at a national park, but you have that on your map, and you say, okay, don't go there, and that's it. Same thing with like ESA designated critical habitat by and large. But you can also identify some potential areas of concerns that may warrant some additional look. So that gets you now you can move on to Tier 2. And I should say a lot of times Tier 1 and Tier 2 are a bit merged, but there is, in the interest of time here, I think the biggest thing for Tier 2 is if you kind of get past that, hey, there's nothing obvious there. Now you want to get out, and more often than not, a Tier 2 characterization includes a visit, a field visit to the area to make sure what you're seeing on your maps matches what's actually on the ground, and so that's kind of the main thing. So in a lot of what happens in that Tier 2, once you kind of get that additional information, and this is where you usually are, not only doing your ground truth, you're also working, oftentimes that's where the first, going in and sitting down with the field office, Fish and Wildlife Service, or the state agencies, so you have a real good sense of what's going on there, and that's where a lot of the micrositing can happen. You say, hey, there's an eagle nest, here, so you want to stay X distance away from that. That's called micrositing. That's saying, okay, we can eliminate these spots here and there so that we can, reduce our potential for impact. Tier 3 is the field studies. So that Tier 1 and Tier 2 is largely, A, are there any things that are real things to stay away from? B, where are the areas that you need some more information, you need some more data? And that informs your Tier 3 field studies. So now you're going out, usually retaining an expert contractor that does this stuff, and whether it's related to birds or bats or eagles or anything else, you're kind of classifying the resource there, from a wildlife standpoint, and trying to identify any potential for significant adverse impact, and eventually what kind of mitigation, if any, is available to address that. So in Tier 3, you are looking at, hey, are there particular species present? Are those species? How are those species using the area? Just because something's there doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be at risk. And that of course leads to what are the risks that are there. And then you look at that, you can classify those potential impacts as low, as moderate, as high, and you can adjust your permitting or your planning and development based on that characterization. And then Tier 4 and Tier 5 really is about, once you're through construction, I know we have an operational webinar that'll come up, but it's a post-construction study. So you spend the Tier 1, 2, and 3 classifying the wildlife and habitat presence, potential impacts, what you think those impacts might be, how you might mitigate those. After you construct, you'll at least for a year, sometimes for more, you'll monitor that, and particularly when it comes to direct impact, you'll monitor that and just make sure that everything you thought might happen is where you are, or less, hopefully. And then Tier 5 would be, well, if you're wrong and your Tier 4, meaning the post-construction monitoring indicates a higher impact than you thought, significantly higher impact than you thought, then Tier 5 would kick in, where you would look at what you can do to bring it back to where you originally expected. So I mean that's the main. I mean those are the tiers for the wind energy guidelines. There are other things in the wind energy guidelines, including some best management practices. So this is there are things, whether it's related to a lot of it's related to birds and to bats, where you look at, for example, lighting, safety lighting on substations, or you don't generally put lighting onto like entry doorways on the bottom of turbines. Those are shown under certain conditions at certain parts of the year to attract bird flocks and result in higher levels of mortality. Very simple solution: just turn those lights off, and you largely avoid that potential impact. So those are kind of the things that we've identified over the years as being just BMPs that should be implemented regardless of where your tiered process goes. There's also some direction on mitigation in the WEGs, and then what is an important part of doing this correctly is coordination, cooperation with agencies, NGOs, and other entities, and that's written up as well as part of the WEG. So it's kind of very comprehensive. Here's the guidelines. Here's how you go through it. But also, hey, you don't go it alone at any step of the way, and really work with the related partners and entities that can work with you. So it's kind of getting to the end. To our the reminder of where we were, or what I told you, or what I talked about. Again, wind energy, I don't want to forget about the benefits, why we're doing this in the first place. The fact that siting wind farms is not just a wildlife exercise, is not the only impact. There are other impacts. But having said that, the industry, we believe, has demonstrated through its actions over the last couple of decades this commitment and this legacy to care when it comes to wildlife that continues to this day and to the foreseeable future. And a lot of that kind of comes together in the wind energy guidelines and how those are used to help inform and result in responsible development of projects. I think that's all I had, and I am open to any questions that anybody might have.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mike. Super informative, really great presentation. And we already have a lot of good questions coming in. Before I hop over to the questions, I just wanted to point out, you were talking about some of the efforts for bat risk assessment and then impact minimization and mitigation. And DOE fairly recently, I guess this was last spring, awarded I'm on the press release here, $6.8 million in wind energy research projects, and most of them are focused on smart curtailment strategies for bats, as well as detection and deterrent technology evaluation, development and evaluation for bats. So if people are interested in learning more, I'm just going to post the link in this notes box here. And we're going to be coordinating some webinars through NWCC with the organizations that are awardees and that are conducting these studies, so you all can hear more about those. And we got one question clarifying that the site you were talking about that had a higher than expected eagle take is Altamont Pass in California, Altamont Pass Wind Resource Area. And so I just wanted to clarify that that's the site that you were talking about, and there is a little bit of a story on the AWWI website that talks about the history of that site and how some of those problems have been addressed over the years and are still being addressed, and some of the collaborative efforts that were inspired by what was happening at Altamont. So I posted both of those links here at the top of your notes box if folks are interested in learning more. All right, and I'm going to dive right into these questions. If anyone has any questions, go ahead and type them into the Q&A box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And again, you'll only be able to see the questions that you typed, so I will be reading them out loud. All right, so our first question is about the length of leases. Is there a reclamation part of the lease? And also, is there a clause for the developer to renew the lease at the end of the lease period?
Yeah, so I can answer that in a couple of different ways. I mean, generally, the leases have to be at least on the order of 20 or 30 years, because that is called the financial life of a project. So if you're a developer and you're going to invest the capital to build a project, you need to operate it for at least 20 to 30 years to make it financially viable. So that's the general answer. In terms of whether there's an extender to that, I think oftentimes you could probably say that there's some option for extending. Often the landowner does have some say in that. So that's, but that depends. It's really company specific how they do that. As far as the question was on reclamation, as far as, again, these are generally private agreements, but I guess I could say oftentimes there is some provisions in there for decommissioning, is what the general term is for that. And then often, a lot of times, the decommissioning requirements are addressed in called the local permitting process, so the local entity. And it depends what state you are, whether you get your ordinance or siting permit from a local township or a county, or in some places a state. There's, especially these days, there's almost always a decommissioning provision in that permit that requires a company to A, do the decommissioning, and B, post some sort of financial security in the case that the company is unwilling or unable to do so, that the regulating entity has the ability to draw from that financial assurance and do it themselves.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we have a couple of questions about curtailment. So for those who are not familiar with this concept of curtailment and cut-in speeds, could you just explain that a little bit? And you were talking about reducing cut-in speeds. What does that mean?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So generally, before we for that West Virginia project, I mean, wind projects, operators or OEMs, which is original equipment manufacturers, the people who make the turbines. Obviously, well, maybe it's not obvious, but you need the wind to be blowing at a certain speed before you're able to essentially spin the blades and create power. We call that the cut-in speed. That's generally about in the 3.5 meters per second range or so. And so once wind speeds exceed that amount, and the blades start spinning and you start generating electricity. When the wind speed goes below that amount, they will cut out, and the turbine will stop generating electricity. Initially, I mean, a lot of that, what would actually happen is when the wind speed would go below that amount, the blades would still actually keep spinning, and that was because you didn't want to totally stop them, because then you have to restart them again when the wind speeds pick up. And so when we call it, what feathering is you adjust the controls so that when you go below that cut-in speed, the blades pitch, turn out of the wind, and the blades actually stop or get very close to stopping. So in the sort of initial evaluation of, okay, why are the bats running into the blades, we found that there's a correlation between wind speed and bat activity. There's a lot of theories for why there is that correlation. One of them is that as the wind speeds increase, the insects that they feed on are less likely or less able to fly, especially as you get higher up, and so there's no food, so the bats don't go to where there's no food, and so they are not up in the wind-swept, rotor-swept area and exposed to the blade area. So that's kind of, so that's what feathering, and then the cut-in speed says, well, at 3.5 you do get a benefit for the feathering, but if you raise that cut-in speed and say, okay, now let's just make the cut-in speed 5.0 meters per second. Now those blades are not spinning at even higher wind speeds, which can be more protective of bats as well. So, and that's been shown on a number of different studies that there is that effect, that there is a significant decrease, and that's why that is right now the sort of leading approach in terms of reducing impacts to bats. I don't know if that made sense to whoever asked the question. I tried to get that in a quick explanation.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. If anyone has any other specific questions or terminology they didn't understand in that explanation or anything else, just go ahead and enter your question into the Q&A box. So the next question is about noise from wind turbines, and the person asking the question is saying that in Europe, noise-related curtailment is significant. Is there anything related to turbine noise in terms of curtailment? Does that come in with setbacks from residential areas? Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So again, there's the sound is a bit of a complex subject, but I think the quick answer there is that curtailment for noise is not necessarily hasn't been a big thing here, but that's largely because the projects are initially developed in a way that is in compliance with, there's generally some sort of noise limit applicable at the property line and or at a nearby, next closest residence. So you can design a project, and the modeling for noise is actually quite sophisticated and quite accurate, and that's been shown through a number of different validation studies. So if for example a noise restriction says you can't generate more than 50 decibels at a home, you can arrange your turbine layout such that they won't generate that level of noise or that level of sound at a home. There are what are called low noise modes on turbines these days, so that may get to that question a little bit. So in other words, if you need to have more flexibility in where you're setting the turbines within a project, you can employ these low noise modes at some or all of your turbines so that you can meet those standards. That does result in, you might call it curtailment. It's not the same as what I just explained, but it is something that reduces the electricity produced, but also reduces the level of sound that is emitted from the turbine. So that's I don't know if that kind of gets you there. But as far as just it's a project by project may do it where they may make decisions on individual turbine basis even to enact those low noise modes or other operational approaches to reduce noise levels at certain receptors, but it's not sort of a blanket type of approach that has been deployed here.
All right, great, thanks. The next question is about habitat loss and fragmentation. So they're asking, wind energy may only be responsible for a fraction of a % of direct mortality for some species. But there's a recent study published in Science that found that habitat loss is the most significant threat to birds. Does the wind industry's legacy of care extend to habitat loss and fragmentation issues? Could you discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it is an important issue. Like I said, that is accounted for in the WEGs. And the, what is the impact of habitat fragmentation to birds? I think there's still some to be learned there. And what kind of habitat are you talking about? What species are in that habitat? How are they using that habitat? And does the presence of wind turbines impact those, and how does it impact those? So I think the quick answer is yeah, of course it's something that we look at. From a habitat standpoint, I think there is some work to be done to fully understand what those impacts might be. But again, it's is there a relative way to look at that as well? A lot of habitat is impacted by a lot of different human activities, and I think wind energy's relative to that is fairly small. But again, doesn't mean that it's something to be ignored or sloughed off. So yeah, it's definitely part. I guess the quick answer is yes. It's definitely part of the way that we look at wind projects. But it's not all habitat is the same.
Right, and I'll add in that this is certainly something that the organizations and initiatives that are working on wind energy and wildlife interactions and challenges and that research, that's certainly something that is coming a little bit more to the forefront, and there's been more investment recently in exploring that from a research perspective. All right, our next question turns to the WEGs. Could you explain further what an early consultation in Tier 1 and Tier 2 with state and federal agencies entails, and how does the industry track how the agency's input is taken into account?
Let's see, if I can get that. So the first part of the question, I mean, what does that look like? If you're talking about Tier 1, Tier 2, if you recall as we went through that, a lot of that is getting the baseline information, the base information. What do we know about an area, just kind of on the ground? So that first consultation usually is just hey, we're looking at this area. So we generally don't have, say, a very well-defined turbine layout. We don't have, even strict borders on where the project would go. It's just sort of, it's oftentimes just a, hey, this is the general area we're looking at, and like I said, with the GIS resources that we have now, a lot of times come in and say, this is what we know about the area in terms of what's there, and just kind of looking for information from whether it's the Fish and Wildlife Service or a state agency. Do they know anything that's not in, say, the National Heritage Database? Do they know, what's their views and approaches to wind energy development, and just kind of establish that connection and whatever information they have. So that's kind of the first consultation, and hopefully in most cases it goes on from there as you learn more and more about the project, and depending on what the concerns are, you keep that consultation going throughout the process. I forget the next part of that question.
The next part was how do wind companies kind of track or assess how that input from state and federal agencies is applied or incorporated?
Yeah, that's one that's a little bit harder to answer, and it really depends. It depends on the company. It depends on where you are. But generally speaking, I guess I don't have a good answer for that because it's kind of company specific and project specific. But it is something that companies will take and incorporate into their planning. A lot of times it's hard to kind of show exactly how that is. So especially in those early consultations. So if you go in and an agency says, well, there's a ridge there, or there's an eagle nest there that didn't show up on your desktop analysis, you make the change to the layout, or the initial layouts there, and you build your project around it. And it's not necessarily something that's papered and recorded somewhere, but it's something that just goes into the day-to-day planning of the project.
All right, thanks for addressing that. The next question also has to do with the WEGs and kind of assessing the impacts of using them. And it says, the WEGs have now been in operation for 7 years. Has there been any research into how effective they have been in successfully leading to avoidance of sensitive wildlife and habitat?
I'm not aware of any research into that. I think the question is, are they being effective? I think through the process I just laid out, and a lot of it comes into micrositing and to changing the projects as a result of the process you go through. So I think there's a lot of experience with the WEGs and how they work. But as far as research that quantifies that in terms of number of birds or number of bats, I'm not aware of any research that's directly looked at that.
All right, thanks. Interesting question. And pardon me just a second while I adjust the size of these boxes so I can see the rest of the questions. I know this is blank for most people, but this way I can see all of them to read them. So the next question is turning to economics and asks, what is driving the decrease projected through 2030 of the LCOE for wind? And I believe that's levelized cost of energy.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it just comes down to the trend over the last few years, and expected to continue somewhat, is taller turbines and longer blades, to put it simply. And what that does as that trend continues is you're able to produce more energy from one turbine than you could 5 years ago, and the costs. So the additional energy versus the additional cost of doing that, obviously it comes out on the side of energy. So I think there are other things in terms of controls and efficiencies and asset optimization, but I think that those are the big drivers.
Thanks. And we have a follow-up question to that, which is, was there an effect of the steel tariffs on the LCOE during the last couple of years?
Was there effect of the what?
Steel tariff.
Steel tariff.
So it sounds like, and sorry, I'm just not familiar with this at all. They're asking if so apparently there's been a tariff on steel, and if that has affected cost in any way.
Oh, steel. I'm sorry, I misunderstood. Sorry, steel tariff.
Oh, that's all right. Sorry.
Steel or field tariff? What is that? The short answer is yes. That's not my area of expertise, so I can't really comment on the extent or how that goes. But it's something that's definitely been discussed, and then it does have an impact. Yes.
Okay. The next question is turning to golden eagle fatalities and is referencing the figure you had on the slide that talked about eagle fatalities. And they're asking, where did the data come from that golden eagle fatalities constitute 3% of human-caused mortality? And then the second part of this question is, did any of the projects cited in bald eagle habitat conduct robust fatality monitoring rather than rely on opportunistic finds? So just to editorialize a little bit, maybe this is an opportunity, Mike, for you to talk a little bit about what that post-construction fatality monitoring looks like, and like the frequency and that wind companies follow.
Yeah. So the I mean, the first part of it, where does that come from? I mean, there are a couple of papers, and the Fish and Wildlife Services has published a couple of papers in a recent update on the, that was for bald eagles, but they have done that for golden eagles, and we've used other data sources there. I think whoever's asking that question, I'd be happy to talk more about that offline, to kind of give the sort of full documentation of that. But it's largely from public information, and using that to estimate the total impact. And that comes from, I mean, it's the papers that have come out, kind of quantifying the best we can in eagle mortality, golden eagle mortality, from a variety of different sources. So obviously you need to have that relative, what's sort of the wind contribution to that, and what's the relative, the total sort of human activity that results in golden eagle fatalities. As far as the post-construction monitoring, they've kind of set that up. It is part of the WEGs that there's at least 1 year of post-construction monitoring done at projects, and then depending on what state you are in, there are state guidelines and state requirements that may be more or less than that. Or I should say maybe they'd be more, but those studies, like I think I said this before, it's very labor intensive. Walking transects under the turbine. I guess that it's a bit more complicated than that, but they're sort of and a lot of that, especially in the eastern parts and central parts of the country, are focused on finding small things that are really hard to find, like bats. And so a lot of that, so the information comes to look across all of that data, and the AWIC database is a good resource for that, which is the effort to aggregate or pull together all of the information from those post-construction monitoring programs that individual companies have implemented there, so at their projects, and bring it all together, and you can use that data to inform what we know about that. So one kind of simplest way to look at it is you don't necessarily need to monitor at every project for every year that it's operational to get a good sense of what's going on. We have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of seasons of post-construction monitoring data that has, that gives us a really pretty good picture of the type and amount of birds and bats that we see across different regions. And in that data set, the incidence of bald eagles is extremely low. I should say everybody, I think people recognizing bald eagles, I mean, it's a good story, right? The recovery of the bald eagles and the populations, how they're increasing, they're moving into new areas. So, that's great because that species has recovered so robustly. But could it lead to more areas where there could be interactions with wind projects? It could be. So you kind of balance that. Well, why is that happening? It's because populations are flourishing, and so there's clearly no wind energy is not having an impact on current population dynamics of bald eagles.
All right, thanks, Mike. And I am having some technical difficulties, so I'm going to read the next question, and then I'll stay on the phone, but I'm going to have to log out of the webinar room and log back in. I don't think that'll mess anything up, but just to let folks know that that's happening if there's a pause. But while I'm doing that, the next question is, where did the data come from? Oh, sorry, that's the question we just had. All right, sorry, everybody. Please give me just a second to log in on a different computer because I am not able to see the questions any longer.
Well, the page, if I could, I'm looking at one here. There's a question that says,
yes, please, go ahead.
Talk about newer technologies. Could say more about the newer turbines limit mortality, the specific technical advancements, bigger blades, turning slower, making collision avoidance easier. I think it's combinations of some things. It could be that there are fewer. So as we get bigger turbines, so if you look at the areas in like the Alpine Pass or in some of the 1980s areas, if you've ever been to those types of places, and the turbines that were built in 1980 something are these little lattice structures that are very low to the ground. You look at those and it looks like the blades are just spinning really quickly. And that, particularly in an area like that, there's different theories on it, but whether it's the prey base there that's bringing birds of prey into that area, and they, there's just so many of them, and they're, kind of have that fast spinning motion that there's more opportunity to get hit. As the as turbines get bigger, so I don't, you could imagine with those very small turbines getting repowered, where you're bringing in the new turbines, you take 100 of those and replace them with one modern turbine, or 200, depending on which one it is. I mean, it's a significant difference in terms of the number of turbines that are needed. Now, it's of course a much bigger rotor swept area, and I don't think you can necessarily say the blades are spinning slower. The rotations are slower, but the sort of the tip speeds are just as fast or faster. And so, how that plays all in, I don't know. It's kind of outside of my area of expertise, but I think that reduction in mortality is primarily based on the fact that the turbines are higher, so further off the ground, further from a prey base in certain situations, and there's just fewer of them on the landscape, so there's more areas to maneuver between the turbines. But I think there's probably people on this line that know a lot more about that than I do, so that's just my very lay understanding.
All right, thanks, Mike, and I am back up and running. So I will go to the next question, which is a little bit more of a statement, but I think it's worth reiterating. We have a note that while wind turbines are responsible for a very small proportion of anthropogenic fatality for eagles, it's worth noting that this cannot be said for bats. So this comment is really stressing that currently we don't know what the bat populations are for most species, and so we don't know if there are population level impacts or risks of population level impacts for bats from wind turbines. But we do know that wind turbines are an anthropogenic source of mortality that are documented. And so the question is really just bringing to light that the wind industry, this is an issue for the wind industry to continue to focus on. And Mike, you already mentioned several efforts that are going on. I mentioned another one. Is there anything else that you want to say about the investment? I mean, there are a number of projects that are going on under Wind Wildlife Research Fund, and just to stress that this is being taken very seriously.
Yeah, no, I think you said it well there. I mean, it does depend on the species. I think the Myotis species, the Indiana bats, and the northern long-eared bats, I think it is still true that the wind energy impacts number of fatalities due to wind energy is far lower than, maybe not anthropogenic, but things like white nose syndrome are clearly the far bigger the threat to those species than wind. I'm talking about some of the non-migratory birds. I think there's a number of things that play, and as Paige said, I think wind energy is absolutely looking at our impacts there, and seeing undertaking a number of different efforts to address that. So yeah, I think that's a fair point.
Okay, great. And if anyone has any other questions and just wants links to other resources about bats and wind energy, just let me know either in the questions, or you can send an email to the email address in the webinar room, and we can follow up with additional links. All right, the next question is asking, do most or all wind farm developers or development projects follow the wind energy guidelines?
Yeah, we don't have a good tracking of that. I think, can't say all, but I'm pretty comfortable saying most. And the basis for saying most is that if you look at sort of the installed capacity and the development projects and who's doing that, it's fairly top-heavy. Sort of the top 10 or 15 companies are responsible for a pretty large percentage of the development and operation out there. And those top 10 or 15 companies are very engaged in what OEA is doing, what AWI is doing, most of them, and are following the WEG's feel pretty confident in saying that.
Okay, great. The next question goes back to our discussion of curtailment for bat impact minimization. What are the prospects for an industry standard of using a 5 meters per second cut-in speed during fall bat migration period?
Well, prospects for that, I think there's, I think we're considering a lot of things, and it goes back to Paige's point of the investments, looking into solutions. I think something like that, just because of the cost of doing that, and the fact that it is not something that works all the time to the same level, that it's I would say just doing a blanket 5 meters per second during all seasons on all nights is not a very efficient way to do it, and not something that we would necessarily pursue. I think that's why this research into deterrence, and particularly into smart curtailment, is so important, because for those that kind of are following that. So right now, when I talked about before the curtailment as being kind of the leading way, or the accepted way across many many projects for how best to do this. The way that's deployed now is that during the higher risk, usually in the fall season, but sometimes through the entire active season for bats, it's that 5 meters per second, or whatever the level is, every night, all night. We know that bats are not always there every night, all night. So the challenge is to figure out, can we predict when the bats will be there, and then curtail during just those times? And that would greatly reduce the cost of doing that, and I think something like that is something that we're very interested in doing in a far more comprehensive way, and rather than just doing blanket, call it dumb curtailment, across all projects at all times.
Great, thank you. The next question asks, how is the industry supporting advancing the science on wind-wildlife interactions as it relates to pre-construction siting?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Cut out a little bit.
How is the industry supporting advancing the science on wind-wildlife interactions as it relates to pre-construction siting? So I think the question is getting at, is the industry involved in research about species ranges and flyway corridors and things like that, areas in pre-construction siting that could inform siting at those initial maps you were talking about?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. I think, I should say, how we're advancing that, that's been a lot of the focus over the last 10 to 15 years, taking the pre-construction survey data and trying to correlate that to risk. And I would say, frankly, there's not been a lot of success doing that. It's been proven to be very difficult to, if impossible, to find anything that you can find pre-construction that's going to directly give you an idea of what's going to happen post-construction. And there's different ways of dealing, of trying to model that, but a lot of that is just hasn't come. And it's not through lack of trying. I think there's been a lot of, companies do spend quite a bit of money on that pre-construction survey efforts to get that data. And there are some research projects through the Research Fund and other areas that are trying to look at some of that, whether it's acoustic data on activity, and trying to correlate that in some way to risk. So I think we're continuing to do that, and with artificial intelligence and other advances in the way we can process data, maybe we'll be able to come up with something like that. And I think a lot of that is related to the smart curtailment question. So being able to correlate sort of those environmental conditions to activity and risk is where a lot of research could be focused now. So yeah. The short answer is we've contributed quite a lot to advancing that. Just haven't gotten good answers in terms of pre-construction surveys informing post-construction risk.
All right, and so we have 1 minute left, and I'm going to ask you a really quick and easy question, and you will see in a moment that that's sarcastic. So to wrap us up, As offshore wind becomes more popular, what work is being done to reduce environmental impacts in the offshore environment? What can you say about that in 1 minute?
In 1 minute? Well, I think there's a lot being done by a lot of different entities, whether it's state or some of the regional entities, and I think there's a lot of research to be done there. That's the quick answer. There's a lot of work to be done there. I think a lot of the land-based lessons can be applied offshore, but it's an emerging thing. I think it's an emerging question that we're looking at.
Great, great short answer. So we are right at the end of our time, and I want to remind everyone that some of these resources that I've posted links to address some of these issues as well. For example, 3 of the DOE FOA awarded projects focus on offshore monitoring. So that's an example of some of the research that's just really starting to get off the ground. And another reminder, since there were a lot of questions about things like risk minimization strategies and technologies, we will be hosting an additional webinar in this series next year that focuses on operational considerations, which includes risk minimization. And lastly, just a reminder once again that the presentation recording will be posted on the NWCC website. I anticipate we'll post that certainly within a week, within the next few days. So please check back there and watch out for your NWCC newsletter. That'll have that link as well. And with that, I want to extend a huge thank you to Mike. Thank you for joining us today and answering some tough, in-depth questions. But I know people really appreciate the opportunity to speak with an expert associated with the wind industry and get some clarification on some of those things. So a huge thank you. And that's all from us. So we will sign off. Goodbye, everybody.